Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me. And thank you for staying all the way to the last talk on a 3-day conference. I know that it is very hard to keep the energy going all the way to the end of a conference and the very end of the day. This has been a great conference. I want to thank the organizers, the staff, the volunteers for an amazing conference. I go to a lot of conferences, and this has been absolutely world-class. The curation of the talks, the quality of the speakers, the organization, the AV, the food. Please, let's all give them a round of applause. And before we get started, we have to do the pre-talk speaker selfie, because if it doesn't end up on Instagram, did it even happen? All right. With that important business out of the way, hello, I'm Laurie. I helped co-found NPM Inc. I didn't invent NPM, I just did all of the other stuff. And I'm currently Chief Data Officer there. But what I really am is a web developer. I've been a web developer for 23 years now, which means that I have been writing HTML longer than some of you have been alive. But making the web bigger and better and more accessible by getting more people involved, that is what really motivates me. And I know that you were all expecting a talk about the future of JavaScript, but at the last minute, I decided I would just throw the whole thing out, and instead, this talk is going to be about micro frontends. Can you even imagine? This is just a joke for like the 5 people who spend way too much time on Twitter and will understand this joke. What I'm really here to talk about is JavaScript. I'm going to talk about who we are, we the people who write JavaScript, where we use JavaScript and what we're doing with it today. And I'm also going to talk about why we're doing this stuff, the forces that got JavaScript and us into where we are today. And then finally, I'm going to talk about what comes next. I'm going to look at all of the trends that we're seeing and make some guesses about where it's going. The goal of this talk is to give you a sense of where you are in the landscape of JavaScript and where your current tools and techniques sit in that landscape, because too many developers work in a sort of vacuum. You don't know if the stuff that you're doing is a best practice, or if it's a fad, or if it's this outdated technique that nobody does anymore. Too many people are like, I don't know, I'm just going to do this thing and hope it's okay. But we know, and we should be able to share that information with you. So I hope you'll leave this talk feeling good about one thing that you're using, and realizing it's time to move away from one other thing that you're using, and also curious and excited about learning one new thing. But before I say all of this stuff, it's worth asking how we know all of this stuff. I have 3 main sources. First, the NPM registry logs. Every time you download a package, we see it happen. They contain an enormous amount of information about what JavaScript developers are up to. Second, we went out and asked people directly. 2 years ago, we did a survey of 16,000 JavaScript developers, and last year we did a bigger one of 33,000 JavaScript developers and asked you directly, like, what are you using and why? And I also supplemented and double-checked our numbers using the excellent State of JavaScript survey run by independent members of the community. Incidentally, while this talk is strictly about JavaScript, if you are interested more in CSS, the same people who did the State of JavaScript survey this year for the first time did a State of CSS survey, and it's full of fun information about what is going on in the world of CSS. And the website is an absolute nightmare of CSS transitions because they just threw in everything that they could possibly do. And before we dive in, a few quick disclaimers. Some of what I'm presenting here is facts, and some of what I'm presenting here is opinions, and I've tried to be as clear as possible about when I'm doing which one of those things. Sometimes people see a graph that I present that says that a technology that they love is getting less popular, and then they get mad at me. And what I'm asking you to do is, I have a bunch of really terrible opinions. Get mad about the opinions. Don't get mad about the graph. The graph is just a thing. You can't get mad at it. It's just happening. I don't have a horse in this race. Other than NPM, I don't contribute to any of the projects that I'm talking about. So I'm trying to, just present the facts without any bias here, but all facts have bias. Secondly, a lot of what I'm talking about involves relative popularity of technologies, and I want to make clear that just because a technology is popular, that doesn't mean that I think it's the best technology. In fact, I don't even know what the best technology means. Evan Yu, in his talk yesterday, gave a really great description of the sort of space that frameworks in particular live in. It's this sort of multidimensional space where you can't even know what's best. There is no best. There's just, trade-offs that you make in all sorts of directions. So, for technology, popularity is useful. If there are a lot of people using your technology, then there are going to be a lot of blog posts, a lot of tutorials, a lot of questions answered on Stack Overflow. There will be a lot of people helping find and fix bugs. So if you work with something that's very popular, it often makes your work easier, regardless of how good that technology is, by whatever definition of good you want to use. So popularity is what I have data about, and popularity is what I'm talking about, but I'm not saying that things are better. And finally, I really love this stuff, and I tend to get very excited about this stuff, and when I get excited, I curse like a drunken sailor, and there's just nothing I intend to do about that, so you're all just going to have to deal. So, who are we, JavaScript developers? The answer is, we're pretty much like all developers at this point. When we set out to get these questions, I was like, oh, well, I'm expecting JavaScript developers to be different demographically in some way. Maybe we're younger. Maybe we work on different stuff. No. It turns out that almost everybody who is a programmer gets to do JavaScript these days, and so we look like all other programmers. We have the same age distribution, the same levels of education. We work in every industry and in every country in the world, and the reason is there are just so many of us. There are 11 million JavaScript developers in 2019. And those 11 million developers are using more open source software than any other language community has ever used before. The NPM registry is the largest repository of open source software of any kind, and by any measure, by number of modules, by lines of code, by number of users, whatever measure you want to pick, it is more than twice as big as the next biggest registry. Of course, everybody knows that JavaScript in particular has a tendency to use lots of modules, so maybe that's not a fair comparison. So, does having a really big registry translate to any other kind of activity? On GitHub, JavaScript is the largest language by number of repositories, by number of issues, and by number of lines of code, and it has been for 7 years in a row. On Stack Overflow, they did a survey of 80,000 developers, and JavaScript was, again, the most popular language, with 68% of all developers in their survey saying that they use it. Of course, you're all at JSConf, so you probably knew that JavaScript was pretty popular, but here's the truth. JavaScript is the most popular programming language in the world today, and because there are more developers in the world today than ever before, it is the most popular programming language that has ever existed. As JavaScript continues to grow, the JavaScript community is changing. The one thing that we noticed that's changed about us between our survey in 2018 and the one we did this year is that JavaScript developers are getting more experienced. They've been writing JavaScript for longer. We especially noticed this with NPM itself. A year ago, half of NPM users were what we consider new. They'd been using NPM for less than 2 years, and this year only 36% are. Round about 2014 and 2015, there was a massive spike in the number of NPM users. It was when the existing pool of JavaScript developers sort of latched onto the idea that NPM was a thing that they should use, and they all showed up at once. And today, the number of new NPM users and the number of new JavaScript users is pretty much the same. Basically, anybody who learns JavaScript learns NPM at the same time, and all of the people who had learned JavaScript before NPM came along have at this point pretty much all adopted it. So now we believe that about 99% of JavaScript developers use NPM. That's part of why we have so much information, and it's part of why, in this talk, I use the terms like NPM users, or respondents, or JavaScript developers as pretty much interchangeable because they pretty much are. This ever-growing pool of increasingly experienced JavaScript developers means that we've seen a shift in what people care about. We knew from analyzing last year's data when we cut people up by how long they'd been doing JavaScript that more experienced developers care more about best practices. They do more bundling, they do more linting, they care more about security, they care more about everything. And because all of JavaScript is becoming more experienced, that's now true of all JavaScript developers as a whole. Since last year's survey, the number of people concerned about the security of their open source has increased. In the last 2 years, NPM has introduced two-factor auth to help protect package publishers from having their accounts stolen, as well as a security team and a bunch of automation behind the scenes to detect and flag malicious packages. But malicious packages, while they get a lot of press, they're not really the biggest source of security vulnerabilities. The biggest source of security vulnerabilities is accidental vulnerabilities, vulnerabilities caused by you using a package with a known security vulnerability and not updating your dependencies. So, last year, we introduced the npm audit command, which will find and fix security vulnerabilities in your application by upgrading to a more secure version of that package. In the last 30 days, we have performed more than 335 million of these audits, because they happen every time you run npm install. If you think that your company should be doing more about JavaScript security, and it probably should, then you'll forgive me if I spend a little time mentioning npm Enterprise. npm Enterprise gives you your own registry on your own domain with your own npm website, where you can see what your devs have published. You can publish your own packages. You can search within all of your company's JavaScripts. You can see full package pages and readmes. It's just like having your own little npm universe inside of your company. It includes single sign-on support and extra security and compliance reporting, which is the kind of stuff that big companies need. Basically, if you are a big company, you should probably be using it. And if you are a smaller company, we have a product called Orgs, which does many of the same things and is a lot cheaper. So, back to the survey data after that terrible, terrible sales pitch. I was wearing the rainbow shirt, and there's rainbow unicorns on the stage, and I have been, for the entire 3 days, I've been telling myself I'm going to do some of this talk while sitting on the damn unicorn, so that's going to be this section. So another aspect of our increasingly experienced user base is that people actually care about the software licenses that they use. That was kind of a surprise, because like people think of JavaScript developers as being cowboys who just like throw shit in there without looking at it. But it turns out that 58% of JavaScript developers say that the software license affects their decision to use an open source package. And 55% of those people say that their company actively prevents them from using certain software licenses. So overall, 29% of people are prohibited from using certain licenses. What licenses exactly? Well, unsurprisingly, the GPL and the AGPL are unpopular because of the restrictions that they place on commercial development. But bigger than those was unrecognized licenses. Basically, anybody who cares about licenses has to hire a lawyer to tell them which licenses are okay. So if you use a license that they've never heard of, they have to go back to the lawyer and pay the lawyer more money, and nobody wants to do that. So if you're releasing open source software, by all means, include some kind of license, but stick to one of the big popular licenses, because otherwise people will just go, this license is too weird, I will not use it. A really great example of that was Facebook tried to change the license that React is licensed under. And like, React, very popular, Facebook, very large company, but even they could not get past the battery of annoyed lawyers going, no, we do not want to have to figure this out again. Go back to MIT. And the final aspect of who we are that I want to touch on is a consequence of how ubiquitous JavaScript has become, which is that 25% of JavaScript developers don't consider JavaScript to be their primary language. Because JavaScript is so popular, it's become inescapable, and because it's inescapable, it means that there's a lot of people who program JavaScript who are doing so because they have to, not because they want to. And that is going to show up in a bunch of places in this data. So, what are these other languages written by developers who don't primarily write JavaScript? Well, the top of the list is TypeScript. TypeScript is an interesting case, and I'm going to talk more about it in a bit. But there's also lots of Python and Java and C and C# in there. And we'll see the effect that that's having later. Interestingly, 12% of JavaScript developers say that JavaScript is the only language they write. It's just all JavaScript all the time for 12% of you. But 88% of you are writing something else. So, now we've covered who we are. We are all over the world. We are every age and experience. We are increasingly sophisticated, and we care more about licensing and security than we used to. Where are we writing all of this JavaScript? Well, the answer is every goddamn place you can imagine. First, and most obviously, is browsers. 97% of us are writing code for browsers. 77% of us are also writing JavaScript for servers. So Node.js is obviously still a big part of the JavaScript community. But there are two big surprises in here, and the first one is native apps. 46% of JavaScript developers are writing native apps, and 13% of us are doing embedded apps. I'm going to dig into all of these numbers because they're fascinating. First off, when people write for browsers, do they target the mobile web or the desktop web? Well, the overwhelming majority, 72%, target both. But despite all of our talk about mobile first, a vanishingly small number of people target only mobile. And 27% of us are getting away without thinking about mobile at all. That is probably a legitimate number because there's lots of applications where it's never going to be used on a phone. Like it's some internal admin application, like no one's ever going to be running that on their phone. But let's talk about native apps. 46% of JavaScript developers are writing native apps. By a native app, I mean an application that runs directly on your desktop or your phone. I don't mean like, it's not a shortcut that's, actually a web app. It's being either transpiled or it's running directly with full access to the file system like an Electron. We were very careful about how we phrased this question to make sure that that was what people were answering about this year. Because when we asked it 2 years ago, we used this ridiculously vague language, and everybody was like, well, sometimes people look at it on mobile, so it's a mobile app. I'm like, oh, great. Anyway. I'm a very bad statistician. Anyway, where are we writing these native apps? As you can see, the biggest group is mobile devs. 35% of respondents said that they are writing native mobile apps. That's of all JavaScript developers, 35% are writing native mobile apps. And 26% of respondents are writing native desktop apps, and a big chunk are doing both. So what are they using to do all of this stuff? Amongst the desktop developers, 26% of devs say that they write native desktop apps, and we have a bit of a puzzle here because most of what we think of as being desktop application development in JavaScript happens in Electron. But only 21% of people say that they use Electron. So there's 5% who are writing native desktop apps but not using Electron, and I don't know what they're using. If you know what they're using, please tell me. On the native mobile app side, I measured the popularity of frameworks for native mobile apps. I'm going to explain how I measured this in a second, but for the moment, just believe me. That green line is all native mobile app development. As you can see, it's staying pretty much constant, but what's happened is it's fragmented. Cordova used to be the only game in town, that's the yellow line, but its share is going down in favor of the red line, which is React Native. Now they're both equal at about 19% of JavaScript developers. But if you're using some other framework to do native mobile app development, please tell me about it. The final where question is about server-side apps. Where are we deploying them? So 77% of us are writing server-side apps. And unsurprisingly, Docker and other container applications like Kubernetes are everybody's jam. Everybody's deploying that way these days. But deployment platforms like Heroku and Netlify and stuff like that are surprisingly popular. And VMs are a surprisingly unpopular choice. I don't know if I'm just old school, but I sort of think of VMs as being like the default way that you deploy software, but they're not anymore. But the real surprise in these numbers was serverless. Serverless has leapt out of the sort of early adopter category, and at 33%, this is a mainstream technology now. So now let's talk about what we're using to do all of this. As with the who and the where sections, this I'm going to try and keep as factual as possible. To measure this stuff, I use a metric called share of registry. It's a very useful metric, but it's also a somewhat confusing metric. It was the one that I was just using. So I'm going to explain it briefly. This is a graph of weekly downloads from the NPM registry. At the moment, we do a little under 12 billion downloads every 7 days. And that number has grown by 26,000% since NPM became a company. And that presents something of a problem. First, it presents something of a scaling problem, but it also presents something of a problem if you're trying to measure the popularity of stuff, because download numbers always go up. Download numbers go up for everything. Here's a graph of downloads of some major front-end frameworks. They're all growing pretty fast. In fact, everything in the registry is constantly growing in terms of download numbers. Even the shittiest package in the registry is getting more and more downloads every week just because more and more people show up every week and are like, I don't know, I'll download evil package 1. This seems fine. So using absolute growth of downloads is not a good way of measuring popularity. So instead, we're using relative popularity as a percentage of all downloads. And that's what we call share of registry. So here are all the same packages again, using share of registry as the metric instead. And suddenly what's going on is much clearer. Some stuff is going up, some stuff is staying flat, and some stuff is going down. But it's important to remember that going down is only in relative terms. So it just means that you're not growing as fast as everything else. If you stay flat on this graph, that means that you grew 26,000%. If you're going up on this graph, you grew faster than 26,000%. So if you're going up at all on this graph, then you are really growing. So let's dig into these actual numbers. The story of front-end frameworks in 2019 is very simple, and it is that React has conquered the web. React has more than 4 times as many downloads as the next most popular framework, and there has never been anything like this popular in front-end frameworks. Part of the reason for that is because React isn't just a front-end framework. In fact, it's not even a front-end framework. It's just a component model, and that component model is used by web apps, but as we saw with the native apps, it's also used in React Native for mobile, and it's used in Electron for desktop applications. But all of this is just the downloads data. What about the survey where we asked actual people? In our survey, 63% of JavaScript developers say that they use React. But using is a vague term. Do you just use it sometimes, or using it just to try stuff out? So we asked a more specific question. 57% of people say that they write React themselves. 6% say they use React written by other people. But more interestingly, 15% of people say that they don't use React but are considering it, which means that they're even at 63%, which is already an absurd amount of adoption. There still might be room for React to continue to grow. But as you saw in that graph, React's growth kind of seems like it might be slowing down, so it's not clear what's going to happen next with React. To dig even further, we asked people how much they write React. Inside the 57% of people who write React, 49% said that they primarily write React, which means 26% of all NPM users are primarily writing React. A quarter of JavaScript developers are primarily writing React. And if you include the people who write it some of the time, that means 47%, nearly half of JavaScript developers are writing React some or most of the time. There has never been a framework with that kind of adoption. It is changing the way web development works. Moving on to some other frameworks, last year I got into some trouble because I took Angular version 1 and Angular version 2 onwards, and I called them both Angular, and I put them together, and I didn't separate them out, and I was strenuously informed that that was incorrect. Angular version 1 is now called AngularJS. Angular version 2 onwards is a completely different framework that has nothing to do with the first version, and it's called Angular. And I think that that is a little bit confusing. I feel like I was justified in not knowing that there's 2 things called Angular and they're not the same. Anyway, as you can see, AngularJS has been in decline since 2016. And Angular 2 Plus has been in decline since 2017, but again, it's important to keep in mind this is only in relative terms. In absolute terms, both of these frameworks have more users than they've ever had before. In absolute terms, both of these frameworks are still growing. They're just not growing as fast as everything else in the registry. Angular remains an extremely popular framework. 37% of NPM users are using one or the other version of Angular. And 29% of NPM users say that they are using the current version. If you extrapolate out, that means there's probably about 3 million people who do Angular, which is definitely nothing to sneeze at, and probably means that it's not going to go anywhere. So let's look at the next most obvious framework, which is Vue. Vue is the only major framework other than React which is showing strong positive growth, and it is very, very positive. Share of registry for Vue has more than doubled in the last 2 years, which means that downloads grew more than a factor of 10. And our survey data backs this up. 27% of NPM users say that they are using Vue, which is up from 24% last year, which means that roughly the same number of people who are using Vue as are using the current version of Angular. One thing that I haven't talked about so far is web components, and part of that is that web components are built into browsers, so there isn't a share of registry. They're not downloading anything from NPM to use web components. But the other reason is that they just don't seem to be very popular. We didn't ask about them in NPM survey, which was a mistake on my part. The State of JS survey allowed people to volunteer if they were using web components, but less than 1% of web developers did. So I'm not ignoring web components, but my data on them is not very good at the moment. The people who build web components, like the people who work for browsers and build web components, they tell me that web components are much more popular than I believe, but of course they would say that. Moving from the front end to the back end, there has been a real revolution. Previously, if I was talking about the back end, I'd have talked about frameworks like Happy or Ember. And those things are still around, and they are showing basically flat growth in the registry, which is to say 25,000% growth, healthy but not spectacular by the standards of the registry. But now everybody has moved to writing rich front-end apps. Those frameworks, which are about providing static views, they're just not as popular. They're just not as much of a fit for what we're doing. Instead, what's happened is that front-end framework enthusiasts have realized that for performance reasons, they need to deliver pre-rendered HTML from the server. And so they called it server-side rendering, or SSR. And they invented a bunch of stuff to do that, which is to say, they invented backends. So now all of the front-end frameworks are also back-end frameworks. They provide collections of servers and routers that make it easy to build a full server using your favorite framework. I don't know about you, but the idea that I can just write a bunch of components and throw them into an existing framework that does all of the serving and parsing and stuff for me, that's great, but it's also super familiar. I'm pretty sure that is how PHP worked. Someday soon, somebody is going to do this huge flashy launch with an amazing website and be like, you can build a website by just FTPing your React components to a server, and then the circle will be complete, and we will have finished reinventing PHP. So before I talk about these new SSR frameworks, it's important to note that they are all still pretty small. Here, for comparison, is Express. Express is a goddamn giant of a package. It used to be 1.5% of registry downloads all by itself, and while the rest of the registry has sort of grown up around it, it is still very, very big. All of the other frameworks that I'm about to talk about, they are that little flat line at the bottom of this graph. But when you take Express out of the picture, the new picture is very interesting. At the top of our list is Gatsby. Gatsby uses React, and it provides a whole set of tools for hooking it up to backends and providing easy deployment methods for it. Gatsby snuck up on us. In our previous survey, we didn't ask about Gatsby at all. In this year's survey, 8% of people said that they are using Gatsby. For comparison, frameworks that we used to talk about, like Happy and Ember, they're at like 5% and 4%. So Gatsby being at 8% means that it is a real and serious framework that is showing real growth. And next comes a trio of backend frameworks, which all have nearly the same name in a way that is not confusing or irritating at all. First up is Next.js. It's another React-based framework. And our survey respondents love Next.js. About 9% of them say that they use it. The registry downloads data gives Gatsby the edge, but it's clear that those two things are both very popular and pretty close together in terms of the number of users. Then there's Nuxt with a U, which is very much like Next.js, but it's for Vue instead. 5% of devs in our survey say that they use it, and it's showing similar healthy growth. And then there's Nest.js with an S, which is apparently also very much like Next.js, but it's for Angular. Our survey didn't ask about it because I only found out about it quite recently, but extrapolating from its download data, probably about 2% of NPM users are using Nest.js. So closely related to all of these front-end frameworks that are now back-end frameworks is GraphQL. There have been a couple of talks about GraphQL at this conference. It's a pretty fun technology. It is the hot new way of building APIs that power all of this stuff. And as you can see, GraphQL's core library and two of its most popular clients are all very, very steadily climbing in share of registry. And this climb is reflected in the survey data. The survey data says that 22% of JavaScript developers are already using GraphQL. But the really interesting number is that half of NPM users, 49%, say they are considering using GraphQL, which means that 2019 is going to be a very big year for that technology. And the final set of trend data we're going to look at is the hottest trend of all, which is not writing JavaScript anymore. Remember all of those non-primary JavaScript writers, especially the ones coming from typed languages like Java and C# and stuff? This is how their influence is showing up. The biggest part of this trend is TypeScript. Last year, we were caught completely by surprise when we asked people how much if they use TypeScript, and 46% of them said yes. This year, 63% of them said that they are using TypeScript. So we immediately asked a bunch more questions. What does using mean? So it turns out that 15% of people who say that 15% of people are using libraries that are written in TypeScript. And the main culprit here is Angular. Angular is written in TypeScript, so all of the Angular users show up as TypeScript users. But they're not really writing TypeScript, they're just using a thing that is written in TypeScript. It's interesting that both React and Ember have TypeScript now, so the only major framework that doesn't have some TypeScript in it is Vue. But even if you say that you write TypeScript, do you mean that you write it all the time, or just to try it out? Within the TypeScript developers, 52% primarily write TypeScript, and another 34% write TypeScript some of the time, which means that overall 36% of NPM users are writing TypeScript some or all of the time. A third of JavaScript developers don't write JavaScript anymore. That is a stunning change in the landscape in which we're sitting. Incidentally, one of the features of TypeScript is that it has type definition files, and those type definition files are hosted under the types scope, which is on NPM. So I went looking to see exactly how much of registry traffic is the type scope, and it turns out it's 2.5% all by itself, being constantly downloaded by copies of VS Code, which means that we're probably going to need to have a chat with Microsoft about their bandwidth bill. The other part of the not writing JavaScript trend is WebAssembly. Cass just gave a great talk about WebAssembly and gave a whole bunch of good reasons for using WebAssembly and its place in the ecosystem. But in case you somehow were asleep for that, WebAssembly is a technology that lets you take any compiled language and run it on the web at near native speeds. And there's two interesting things about that. The first is obviously the speed, but the people who write WebAssembly say that the much more interesting part is the second part, which is that it gives you the ability to use existing code written in other languages directly on the web. To me, one of the most exciting features of WebAssembly is that WebAssembly modules are interoperable with existing NPM modules written in JavaScript. So you can use a tool like WASMPack, which is for Rust, or equivalent tools for other languages, and you can write code in those languages, publish it as a module to the NPM registry, and then just NPM install it into a JavaScript application, and it will work. You won't even know that it's not JavaScript. It'll just happen. And the way that I know that you won't know it's JavaScript is because it already happened. It is already happening. The call is coming from inside the house. Our stats say that WebAssembly is still very new. Only about 3% of people say that they use it. But at the scale of NPM, that means that about 300,000 people are using it. And we've found that just 0.06% of packages in the registry contain WASM, but that is about 600 packages, and some of those are very interesting. But the big number for WebAssembly is 54%. That is how the percentage of people who say that they are considering using WebAssembly. WebAssembly is about to be very, very big. So now we know who we are and what we're using, and those facts together can point us towards explanations as to why. This is where I switch from facts to analysis, and by analysis, I mean opinions. But first, just a quick drink of water, because I'm going real slow and talking a lot. So for this next bit, I need to split up the room into two teams. So everybody on this side of the line, you are team A. Everybody on this side of the line, you are team B. Team A, let me hear it. Team B. Team A. Team B. Fantastic. I'm not going to use that for anything. It's just to keep you awake after 30 minutes of graphs. The other thing that I said that I would do is I would give a pair of NPM socks away, but I didn't have time to come up with any system for giving the socks away. Is Shivani here? There you are. Shivani had the bright idea of just asking me on Twitter if she could get the socks, so she gets the socks. So, the first question to answer in the why section is, why is JavaScript the most popular programming language in the world? I think we can discard the idea that it is the best designed language in the world. One possible answer is the NPM registry. A guy called Leo Myrovich, for his PhD, did a study in which he researched why people pick programming languages. This is a very useful study for answering this question. So he was asking, is it features, is it speed, is it because they're forced to by their company? Like, what is it that makes somebody pick a programming language? And the number 1 reason turned out to be open source modules. It turns out that if there's a library that exists that helps you get the job that you're trying to get done, then you switch to the language in which that library exists. And because the largest set of libraries is NPM, that means an enormous number of people are moving to JavaScript because of all of the libraries that are existing in NPM. And once you start doing that, a positive feedback loop kicks in. More open source libraries bring more users, and those users write more open source. Once about every 15 minutes or so, somebody on Twitter sends me this picture, but it's not actually a bad analogy. The NPM registry has created a gravity well that pulls in developers, and every time a new developer joins the JavaScript community, they increase the pull. And this has created the new type of JavaScript developer, the reluctant JavaScripter. This used to be a very small group, but is now possibly a quarter or more of the JavaScript community is reluctant JavaScripters. They don't write JavaScript because they like it, they write JavaScript because they have to. And that is bad. That's bad for them because they hate it. But it's also bad for JavaScript because people who don't like a language are not going to write it well. And this happened before. In 2009 and 2010, Ruby developers who were writing web apps got sucked into the exploding popularity of JavaScript, and they fucking hated it. They told us that they hated it at the time. In the survey data, they've made very clear that they still hate it and don't want to be writing JavaScript. Some of them attempted to solve this problem with CoffeeScript, which introduced a ton of Ruby-like features into JavaScript. CoffeeScript failed, but honestly, the Ruby folks mostly won. Like JavaScript these days, modern JavaScript, has a ton of language features that are basically copied from Ruby. And TypeScript is something like that pattern. Remember all of those non-primary JavaScript developers who are working in typed languages like Java and C#? A bunch of people from those languages have come to the JavaScript community and found that they've missed types. And TypeScript gives them those types back. So given the popularity of types and people using those typed languages, and also Microsoft's considerable backing to TypeScript, I don't think that TypeScript is going to be the kind of failure that CoffeeScript was. In our survey, 17% of people who had heard of WebAssembly said that the thing that they found most interesting about WebAssembly was that it allowed them to write a language other than JavaScript, and they preferred doing that. WebAssembly frees web developers, and it frees web development from JavaScript. And the result will be that a bunch of people will stop writing JavaScript. But that is not something to be worried about. First, not everybody will stop, just the people who hate it. And second, when people writing WebAssembly are looking for a way to share code with each other, the massive gravity well of the NPM registry will make it obvious that the best place to share your WebAssembly modules is also the NPM registry. WebAssembly will make JavaScript stronger by giving it access to the best libraries, no matter what language they were written in. That is a tremendously exciting idea. The next question worth spending time on is, what the hell is going on with React? Part of the explanation is that React isn't a full web framework. It has no opinions about routing or data models like other frameworks do. So as opinions change about the best way to do routing and data, people don't have to abandon React to be able to do that. They can just switch from Flux to Redux, and from Redux to whatever's coming next. It's just a component model, and it creates truly reusable, fully functioning components. If you've never seen quite how well that can work, here are two examples of React components that you can just npm install today. Two of the most annoying and fiddly components, a color picker and a date picker, and you can just npm install them. That, my friends, has been the dream for 20 years. I don't want to have to implement a date picker ever again, and now I don't have to. Other projects provide whole libraries of excellent pre-built components to use. React Toolbox does one using Google's material design, although it's not like an official Google project or anything. And Reach UI is an excellent start on addressing accessibility concerns in React by providing a library of fully accessible React components. But now, React can go even further. As you've already heard at this conference, React 16.8 introduced hooks. Hooks are a new way of handling state in React, but from my perspective, the most interesting thing about hooks is that it is very easy to add a whole bunch of functionality to your application using hooks by just npm installing them. An early promising demonstration of this is React Use, which is a library that provides a ton of functionality for the more dark and dangerous corners of the web API in your React app by just npm installing the functionality that you want to use with way less effort on your part. And this suggests an enticing future where we can build web apps at a whole new level of abstraction. All of these things together mean that we won't have to think too hard about what the server is or how it works or even where it is. And we can put existing components together instead of having to build them from scratch every time we start a new project. And each new component added to the pile of components inside of the NPM registry will make it more attractive to use those components again. The same feedback loop that created the NPM registry itself could make React and React components an unstoppable force that changes web development forever. But it's not guaranteed. React's growth seems to be slowing down, and Vue is showing a lot of growth. So is Vue the future? Will React decline and fall like every framework ever before? In the next couple of years, we get to find out. In the meantime, React's dominance on the front end has totally changed the back end. As I showed earlier, frameworks that enable server-side rendering of React apps are now more popular than traditional back-end frameworks. So instead of writing code for clients and servers, we just write code for clients and we get the server to figure it out. We increasingly abstract away how code is deployed and just give it away entirely to serverless things or deployment services. Is that a good idea? Building all apps as rich front-end apps? I'm not sure that that is a good idea. I'm not sure that that's always the best kind of app that we can build, but it certainly is a popular idea. And as I've been pointing out, popularity has its own momentum. At least one browser maker is already working on specific optimizations to the browser to make React faster. And last year, I made the case that React components, or at least some of the core parts of them, should become part of the browser so that we can make our frameworks smaller and we can make our frameworks faster. Because we did that before. We did that with jQuery. A lot of the APIs that were in jQuery are now just part of the web API. We think of ourselves as having stopped using jQuery, but we still use jQuery every day. We just don't need to download a library to do it. So I stand by that. I think some parts of React are so good and so popular that at this point they should probably be part of the web. So let's take all of these trends and analysis and opinions and weave them all together and make some guesses about the future. This is where I go from slightly wrong to extremely wrong. First is a future I don't have to guess about, and that is NPM Tink. NPM Tink is a tremendously exciting leap forward in package management. It's a package manager and a runtime. And you won't have to install packages anymore. You won't have to transpile TypeScript. You won't have to think about WebAssembly. You can just import stuff, and Tink will figure it out. So let's watch that happen. Will it have downloaded the whole video? What you're seeing is two modules in this folder. One is JavaScript, and one is WASM. The main file is TypeScript, index.ts. We import that WASM straight into the TypeScript, and then we use tink.sh to run that TypeScript. We don't have to do any transpiling. We don't have to do any loading. There is no other code in this folder. Tink just figures it out. That's amazing. We don't have to do any of that stuff anymore. The ergonomics of that are wonderful. Dan Abramov tweeted recently about how VB6 is what got him into programming. And it's a really great point because it's exactly where it seems like all of this stuff is going. Imagine a world where you can build a web app without needing to know all the details of how all of your components work. People hate on VB6, but at one point it was the world's most popular programming language, and that's us now. VB6 unlocked and created a generation of programmers by making programming very easy and accessible for everyone. That made it very good and very popular. Think how many more people could get to be web developers if you could build a real and useful web app by dragging and dropping open source components into it. That wouldn't make your job obsolete. We would still need everyone in this room to be writing components, but we would need a room 10 times this size to hold all of the people who would be using the components that we write. It would be a whole new level of abstraction. It would create a whole new type of web developer, and it would unlock a whole new sequence and a whole new class of web apps that currently it's too expensive for anyone to build. That is a tremendously exciting idea. And then you add to that mix WebAssembly, which it's still very early days right now, but you could bring every useful library from every other language and put them into the JavaScript universe and make all of those libraries interoperable with no performance hit. Suddenly, not only is it easier to build these apps in JavaScript, but what you can build would be greatly expanded. And the last piece of the puzzle is all of those native app developers. That's already nearly half of us. Take highly performant, rich web apps and then run them anywhere that you like. On desktops, on phones, on tablets, on watches, on VR headsets, on your shoes. JavaScript running everywhere, absorbing all of the other languages into a single unified world of open source components built by an ever-expanding and increasingly diverse set of developers. There's no guarantee that that will happen. But I can imagine a world where the thing that we currently call web development just becomes the way that we build software. And after 23 years of watching web development change and grow, no time has ever been more exciting to be a web developer. And you, my friends and colleagues, are perfectly placed to become part of that change. The web is an amazing force for good and evil. It is a toy and a tool. It's a playground and it's a marketplace. It is alternately amazing and terrifying in its power. We can do so much good and we can do so much harm, but I choose to believe that in the long run, we will collectively decide to do more things that help the world than hurt it. We have all made mistakes that have hurt people. I know that I have. But I believe that in the course of time, our good decisions will outweigh our bad decisions, and the web will grow forever. I hope what I've shared with you today has helped you see where you are and what you can do. I hope it's helped motivate you and make you curious. I hope you've had a fantastic JSConf. I certainly have. And thank you all so much for your time and attention.